If not, I have the privilege of introducing the guy who is the editor of the book called The Founders. The Founders is a book dealing with the chief prosecutors of the 5 principal trials that were tribunals that were created after Nuremberg. And David was one of those. So I'm looking at his picture on that book back there, and it's a terrific read. Ladies and gentlemen, David Crane.
Thank you. Greg is my one and only fan. Well, it's a real pleasure to be here. And let's see if this works. Jody says it does, and there it is. Hey, we're going to talk. I'm not going to lecture at you. I'm going to give you some parameters, some 4 corners. As educators, as docents, as people who are studying this, just some ideas to think about is how you, in fact, teach this kind of subject to various ages. And that's a challenge, particularly for you. I had the privilege of, when I left the United Nations in 2005, as Undersecretary General and Chief Prosecutor of the International War Crimes Tribunal in West Africa, to go and teach as a professor of law this type of subject at Syracuse University College of Law. Now, those are 22, 23, 24, and 25-year-olds. And you can be a little bit more open as to how you approach atrocity, international crimes, and the horror of it. But for those of you who are at junior high and high school, I want to let you know that I understand and appreciate and respect that as far as how do you introduce that kind of subject to young people who have a different perspective on life and should. One of the things that I'm very much involved in is building a case against President Assad and his henchmen in Syria. And I started, with others, the I Am Syria campaign, 2012, which is both an educative as well as a movement to teach high school students on how to take a subject and turn it into a social justice project and a way by which they can be involved in an atrocity going on in a legal and an appropriate way at the high school level. So all you have to do is Google IamSyria.org, and it'll actually have a web page to show your students how to get involved in a social justice issue and take that and do it in a way to engage with their fellow students, with their community, and their school. But one of the things that we also developed over time is we have a series of lesson plans on how to teach about atrocities going on in a part of the world called Syria. And I'm very proud of this. It's just something that opened up. But we have over 16,000 high school teachers from around the world, or equivalent, have downloaded those lesson plans and are teaching what's been going on or what has gone on in Syria. So they may be also good examples as to how you, as you're thinking, how do I teach this, that might be a good kind of template for you as well, because we certainly have atrocities going on around the world even as I speak. So what are we going to do briefly this morning, because I also want to take time for you to ask questions and to hear your perspectives, is we'll think about the word atrocity, and then we'll skip and we'll talk about the history of the 20th century, the bloody 20th century as I call it, look at the age of accountability, which began in 1993, of which I'm one of the founders of, and then also talk about where this is all going and what I now call, since 2015, 2016, the age of the strongman. And how do we, in fact, seek accountability for atrocity when the world just isn't that interested in doing something about it. And then, of course, the question based on this is, will the legacy of Robert H. Jackson at Nuremberg survive these challenges? All right, so that's kind of what we're going to do briefly this morning, and then we'll talk, and I want your perspectives and your questions. This is important. This is a word, because again, the discipline has shifted from international crimes. What we really call this is atrocity crimes. And this takes into not only international crimes, but domestic crimes, human rights laws, what have you. So we call it violations of that. So we call them atrocity crimes, and we call it atrocity law. It's a larger umbrella type concept. So when you're talking about this area, we now call it as atrocity law, just as an aside. But the word atrocity, And I teach this, frankly, around the world, and the first thing I ask the audience, whether it be students, practitioners, teachers, or whatever, what does an atrocity mean to you? Anybody? And it's just kind of like a Rorschach test. There's no definition, but when I say the word atrocity, what pops to your mind, Charles? I mean, boom. What's that?
The treatment of people as anything other than human.
Okay, treating people not as human beings. That's a very important point. All right, because again, at the end of the day, which we'll talk about in a minute, is that the law, social justice, the international community now has adjusted itself since 1948, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, is that human beings have a legal right to exist. That's very significant from a legal and jurisprudential point of view. Up to 1948, we had certainly religious, moral, ethical statements that human beings have a right to exist, but nothing under law at the international level. And so the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights says that human beings have a right to exist. So very good, Charles. Others, when I say atrocity, raise your hand and just blurt it out.
Genocide.
Genocide, okay, one of the atrocity crimes, one of the what we call international crimes. There are 4 of them at the modern era now. There are genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and the new international crime, which lay dormant for quite some time since Nuremberg, the crime of aggression, which was defined in the Rome Statute that created the International Criminal Court, but unenforceable for political reasons. So it was just there but never defined. In 2010, in Uganda, in Kampala, we defined the crime of aggression. We drew upon the Nuremberg legacy. And then in 2017, the world came together to figure out how to implement this very, very political crime. It's very good, okay? So we have degradation of human beings. We have a type of degradation called genocide, the crime of crimes, all right? Basically, the destruction in whole or in part of peoples. That's the definition. The destruction in whole or in part of peoples. All right. Other questions or other comments. What is an atrocity? Now, I think this is an important question that you need to ask your teacher or your students. And what I do, and I'm not going to do it here because we don't have time, but what I would normally do is say, what is an atrocity? I give you 5 minutes to write 3 things that come to your mind, and then for the next hour, easily the next hour, we would discuss what that means. Okay. So this is, I think, important. If you're going to really start teaching this in a way that is meaningful in the modern era, you have to have your students back off and go, because nobody thinks about this in any way, shape, or form in your normal daily life. But if you're going to be involved in this as a teacher in some form or another, you've got to, in your own mind, as well as shape with your students, just the simple term, atrocity. Okay? Yeah. You're probably saying, well, David Crane, what do you think is an atrocity? An atrocity to me is if an act takes place against a human being and no one does anything about it, and it's as if that human being never existed. All right, and this is, to me, the ultimate atrocity. We don't know who she is, or that child. We don't know how or why that individual did it. It's a German soldier. How do we get a human being to do this? But she has disappeared in the sands of time. All right. So to me, that's the ultimate atrocity, and that's why we now have modern international criminal law. Why we do this is because we have to give these victims a voice. All right, we have to stand up, and for those of you last night who heard our dialogue between Greg and I, that's why we do this. It's for and about the victims. It's for and about the victims, such as this young woman. So, I can teach an entire law course off this slide, but I'm not going to. But I really want you to tell me, what do you see here right in front of you? Anybody? Rachel, what comes right to mind?
Dictators.
What? Dictators? All right, good. Others?
Totalitarianism.
Totalitarianism. All right, keep going. Megalomania. All right, now keep going. You're moving down this road.
Genocidaires.
Genocidaires? Indeed. Yes. Others. Keep going.
Fascism.
Fascism. All right.
Narcissists.
What's that?
Narcissists.
Narcissist.
Perpetrators of war crimes.
Okay, very good. Keep going. It's funny, I always get a kick out of this because everybody answers it differently. Every class I give, and you're doing it just as like any other people around the world. But you're dancing around a very interesting, you're not actually stating the obvious.
They're all men.
Men, yeah, okay, very interesting. Now, why is that? Well, it's not that males have the monopoly on atrocity. It's just that it's the socio-economic, geopolitical time of the 20th century. Men were in control. So that's it. Do women have the capacity to commit atrocity?
Yes.
As we say in the law, hell yeah. Of course. So I think this is important when you're teaching your students. There's a tendency to make it a very male-centric kind of discussion. But you have to go back all the way to Germany and Nuremberg, where we actually prosecuted female camp guards for what they did when they were guarding females in various subcamps in Germany. So women do have a very, there's no gender issue here in atrocity. It's just though it's an interesting face right in front of you is the fact that yeah, they're all male. Others. Anybody? Ah, they're from everywhere. What that means is all peoples, all nations, all countries, all regions of the world have the capacity to commit atrocity. The numbers that you see there are in millions. All right. And it obviously historically goes from your left to right, from King Leopold of Belgium, King of the Belgians. King Leopold II is individually criminally responsible for the destruction of over 10 million human beings. He ruled Belgian Congo with an iron fist for decades. And we never found out about him until someone wrote a book called, by Joseph Conrad, what is it?
Heart of Darkness.
Heart of Darkness, absolutely. Automatic gate. That's how the world found out about atrocities. They read a novel a couple decades later going, holy cow, King Leopold, a European king, destroyed all these people. He's the one that originated the idea that if you don't work for me, I'll just cut your hands off. So there was a whole thousands of Belgian Congolese said, we're not going to work in your slave plantations anymore. So he had his soldiers go in and cut their hands off. Now this is a Belgian king. So again, all peoples, it goes all the way down to my good friend, former President Charles Taylor of the Republic of Liberia. By the way, these slides are available to you. You can have them, and Jody said that she would be glad to give them to you. So, and use them. All right, there's no copyright on it. So, death by government. During the bloody 20th century, on or around 117 million at the lower end, people died at the hands of their own governments. That's one person at a time. Remember I talked to you last night about that. We tend to use numbers, but in this business, numbers doesn't matter whether it's one person or whether it's 117. That's not the point of this. We don't do this by numbers, we do it by intent and by actions. And we honor the people one at a time, to include that young mother. So this is really important when you're talking to your students, is you have to individualize this. Because it gets, a human being just tends to, standing in your way, you probably haven't seen it. You haven't had it. Poor guy who hasn't seen any of the slides I've shown.
Would you go back to slide 3 on this one?
But again, as your teachers, numbers don't matter, it's the human beings, it's the victims. It's all about the victims. That's why we do this. So these are, more in a baseball statistic format, these are the mega murderers of the 20th century. And everybody is always shocked, is all the way down to number 4 is Adolf Hitler. All right? It doesn't mean anything, but everybody thinks when you think of mega murderers, the #1 monster of the 20th century is not Adolf Hitler. All right? He's behind King Leopold II. All right? And then, of course, we have the dictators of Mao and Stalin at horrific numbers. You know, Joseph Stalin had a Chechen problem back in 1936. You know, Chechnya is kind of a semi-autonomous republic in Russia, and part of the Soviet Union. Well, back in 1936, when no one cared, no one knew, he just had the Soviet army ring the whole province and deport all the Chechens to Siberia. That's millions of human beings. There are more Chechens in Siberia today than there are in Chechnya. He just got rid of all of them. We don't do that anymore. Or the theory is we don't do that anymore. Right? But in those days, we just didn't have any accountability mechanisms. And so Joseph Stalin just would wholesale destroy peoples that were in his way. A lot of it unknown to history of mankind, even as we speak. But again, I'm just talking about a sense of the 20th century and where there was no accountability. But boom, right in the middle of this monstrous time, 1900 to 2001, we have these bright and shining 4 years. And I think this is also important that you teach this to your students because it tends to get glossed over. There's a lot of things happening, but there are some very significant points that allowed those of us who founded modern international criminal law to take and use to prosecute somebody who destroys their own citizens. Because again, under law, I can't prosecute you for something that wasn't a crime at the time that you committed it. I can't make up crimes. So if it wasn't a crime at the time you did it, then I can't indict you for it. So I have to draw upon various jurisprudential and legal points in order to create an indictment that will stand up under law. Remember, this is all about the rule of law. These are not kangaroo courts. So you see the International Military Tribunal of Nuremberg got that. For the first time in history, mankind said, we're going to hold accountable under law individuals who destroy human beings. That's at the international level. That's the beginning of the beginning. But then we go nascent after that in the 45 years of the Cold War. And we see the establishment of the United Nations on the principle of we settle our disputes peacefully and only resorting to force as a last resort. All right, that is the cornerstone to the United Nations even as we speak. Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Just talked about that. A human being has a right to exist legally. That is the cornerstone of modern international criminal law, because without that precise point, if I destroy your right to exist as a human being legally, I've committed a crime. Therefore, it's a crime at the time that I did it. Therefore, a chief prosecutor someday could say, you know, Crane committed these crimes destroying the lives of these people. And therefore, if I have statutory authority from the United Nations, I can prosecute you for war crimes, crimes against humanity based on depriving you of your life, the right to life, under the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Now, this is a good one for your students to read. It's a couple pages, right? It's just a couple pages, but from that stems all human rights documents that we use today. The Genocide Convention. Did you know at Nuremberg, genocide was not a crime. There was no crime of genocide. There was no crime at all of it. And so the world thought that through, and Raphael Duncan, a professor at Duke University School of Law, who walked the halls of Nuremberg, barking into the wind about this crime that he was advocating called genocide, human killing. And he was a little obnoxious. Henry King, a prosecutor at Nuremberg, described when you could see, we all have friends in college who are like this. When you walk up to somebody and say, good morning, how are you? That's just a greeting, right? I don't really care how you are. But 15 minutes later, you're still standing with Raphael Duncan telling you how he was, and then he always would bring it back. Hey, I talked to you about the crime of genocide? Well, these are busy people, as you could tell from lots of paper and translations and getting a very major case together. Nobody had the time to talk to this very verbose, right-thinking individual. And so one time, Henry King was carrying papers down, scurrying down the hallway, doing what young trial counsel do, getting ready for trial, and he sees Raphael Lincoln coming down the long hallway at the Hall of Justice there in Nuremberg. And he literally ducked into the supply closet so that, because Raphael didn't see him. He just didn't have time. But he hung in there. The Genocide Convention is the only international convention that defines an international crime, even though they all can be prosecuted. But it calls upon signatories of the Genocide Convention. If a genocide happens, then you have to prosecute, which is both a curse and a blessing. Because what happens is if we see that it's a genocide and people declare it a genocide, we have to do something about it. And diplomats and politicians don't like to have to do something. All right, and so most people don't mention the G word. If you say the G word, then legal requirements kick in. And that's a challenge for those of us that are doing this at the modern era. Then, of course, you have the Geneva Conventions of 1949, protective conventions during time of both international and non-international armed conflict, where we protect people found on the battlefield. It's a compilation of over 500 years of customary international law, various other earlier treaties signed in Geneva, the Geneva Conventions of 1949, and the Protocols Additional of 1977 are the cornerstone by which, if you violate the Geneva Conventions, you're committing a war crime. Okay? So again, you have to have law in order to prosecute. If there's no law, then you can't prosecute. Well, if you abuse human beings on the battlefield, believe it or not, there are law and rules on the battlefield that govern the horror of war. And if you abuse that, like we're prosecuting a Navy SEAL right now, a guy named Eddie Gallagher, who shot a prisoner, an ISIS prisoner, which some people are saying, well, he should have been killed because he's ISIS. Well, if he is a lawful combatant and he's shooting at you, you can kill him under law. But if you capture him as a prisoner of war under Geneva Convention 3, he is now under your protective custody. And if you shoot him in the head like you did with a 9mm and bragged about it, that's a war crime. You can't do that. So you hear all of this stuff. Well, you know, he's a great American. He fought for America and was doing all of this. And you know, this guy was just an ISIS terrorist. That's not the point. We're politicizing an event that is truly a war crime. He has to be prosecuted under the Uniform Code of Military Justice under all the due process that every American has a right to do. And should he be found guilty, he should be held accountable and not pardoned, which a certain individual who we all know is already saying he's going to do regardless of the outcome. So these, look at this, 4 years, this horror story going on. In fact, the worst of it all is happening next, which is the Cold War, where over 90 million human beings died. More people died in the Cold War than World War I and World War II combined. It was a horror show. And most of this, and this is where most of the civilians died that I was showing you in the earlier slides with Stalin and with Mao particularly. So, after all of this horror story, after the Cold War, we see an age of accountability, the Rubicon crossing event, where we see the advent of modern international criminal law, which I had the privilege of being a part of. The world said in 1993, we are going to step away from looking and turning the other way related to atrocity, particularly during the Cold War. And what happened was this, real simply, is that the Truman Doctrine, 1949, said we're going to ring the Soviet Union with friendly nations to try to contain the threat of worldwide communist domination. That was the Truman Doctrine. And so the U.S. was, in particular, was very willing to allow any country that was on our side to do whatever they want internally in their own countries. In other words, the United States said, if you're with us, you can do whatever you, we're not going to interfere or intervene with whatever you do domestically in your country. And so most of the deaths, those 90 million deaths, took place internally for some civil strife, ethnic cleansing, what have you. Guatemala is a perfect example. All right, indigenous peoples paid a horrific price in the Cold War. They always paid a horrific price. but particularly because it was sanctioned, not legal, but it was sanctioned because the United States wanted to ring the Soviet Union with, quote, friendly nations. So a lot of South America, Central America, Asia, South Asia, Southeast Asia, what have you, signed on to this principle, but then we just turned the other way and allowed the particular ruling junta, party, what have you, individual, run amok and take care of business within their own country. So that's where you get that 90 million. Well, in 1993, the wall came down. The world was an amazing place. I remember it. It was like all of a sudden there was no communism in the world. I mean, we lived and breathed it all our entire, I mean, my entire public service career, particularly on the national security side, I basically was going to kill Soviets. That was what I did for a living. And that's what I thought about, that's what I lived with, that's what I designed, what have you. And when that all went away, it was like, holy cow, this is a new world. Remember the song, Coca-Cola, I like your body, Coke, live in harmony. For the first couple of years, we thought, my gosh, this is actually going to happen. There are no commies anymore. Not even behind the bush anymore. We're done with it. And it is crazy how quickly it disappeared. I mean, it disappeared in months. I mean, it went, for all intents and purposes in the geopolitical spectrum, it went poof. It was never there. It was a Potemkin village. You know, particularly in the 80s, they were dissolving internally, and we just didn't understand or know about it because it was such a closed society. We didn't pick up on how bad the Soviet Union had rotted from within, and it really didn't exist. It was being held by chicken wire and tape. And when that one thing happened, they couldn't stop it. And that was Boris Yeltsin standing on that tank saying, we're not taking this anymore. And they couldn't do anything about it because then it just rippled. And within 1 year, it was as if they had never, now that's a good atrocity. It's as if they had never existed. And it went poof. So, amazing. But in 1993, we have the first genocide to be committed in Europe since World War II in the Balkans. And the world said, we didn't have the Soviet Union to veto any kind of initiative anymore at the Security Council. And Russia joined us, and we created the accountability mechanism, the International Military Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. Incredibly, another genocide took place 9 months later in Rwanda. And throughout all this period, over 10 years, between 1991 until 2002, there was a horror story going on in West Africa, one of the dark corners of the world. And people didn't really fully understand the meaning of that until one day the president of Sierra Leone wrote a letter to the Security Council saying, we have a horror story here, I can't do anything about it because I don't have any lawyers or court system left because they've all either fled the country and all their courts are burned to the ground. We don't even have any law books. We can't find any statutes related to Sierra Leone anymore. That's how devastated it was. So we see the creation of the International War Crimes Tribunal in West Africa, called the Special Court for Sierra Leone. And then we have, during this time frame from 1998 with the Rome Statute signed, the world's first permanent international criminal court. These are major geopolitical steps on behalf of the international community. And even though this age of accountability is starting to wane a bit, we can't go back. In other words, we've crossed this Rubicon. We've done what has to be done. We just can't walk away through all of this jurisprudence, this experience anymore. Mankind, fundamentally in their own mind, saying that heads of state, tyrants, dictators, and thugs need to be held accountable internationally or domestically for violating international and domestic crimes. So that's a given now. Now, how that is viewed and done politically is a whole different story. Because at the end of the day, I think this is important that you have to make sure that your students understand, is that the bright red thread of all of this is politics. Bright red thread, politics with a small p. The conflict is a creature of political events. How we decide to end the conflict is a political decision. The creation of a justice mechanism is a political event, and how they draft the statute is based on political compromise. So DNA is in all of these. And you can use politics not in a negative way, because again, within all of these statutes, which are fairly similar, created law that allows the likes of me to go and seek justice for the people of West Africa. They all have in them a statement that says the prosecutor shall not seek or take any advice from any outside entity, be it state, what have you. In other words, even though I was an American citizen, when I was sworn in as chief prosecutor, I became an international diplomat and I was a citizen of the world. And so George Bush couldn't pick up the phone and go, if you ever want to come back in the country, you're not going to indict Charles Taylor. Well, he didn't know I was going to do it anyway, but, you know, or he could pick up the phone and say, if you want to come back in the United States, drop the charges against Charles Taylor. That's direct political influence. Or Charles Taylor calling up, or the family of Charles Taylor, who controlled or had sucked out in the Blood Diamond story, which we maybe talk about in the question and answer, about $450 million. You know, a member of his family calling saying, hey, look, we would certainly love to donate to your favorite charity. If you just give us your bank account number in Geneva, we will donate to that charity. But we would only ask that you drop the charges against Charles Taylor. Or not even say it that blatantly, just my charity. And they never mouth the words, but I get the point, and all of a sudden I find a legal technicality that I can't prosecute a head of state, and so I drop the charges. See how that could get really bad really quickly? Of course you would never do something like that. But again, you know, I'm legally bound not to even do that kind of politics. What I'm talking about is just you have to appreciate the political aspect of being a chief prosecutor in a part of the world and understanding the political ramifications of what you're about to do, to include taking down a sitting head of state for the first time in the modern era. And what does that mean? And how is that going to impact on West Africa? And not just West Africa, but Africa, and then what's the United Nations going to do, etc. So you have to be very savvy on that. 70% of my time, once I got my prosecution strategy working and people in court prosecuting these bad individuals, 70% of my time was spent on diplomacy and politics, traveling the world, talking to politicians, diplomats about the importance of justice in West Africa. I didn't talk to them about, nor did they tell me what to do, but as far as the actual indictments, but listening to him, talking, and getting their perspectives and advice. Very, very important to maintain that political support to what you are doing. To include, when I did take down Charles Taylor, I wasn't denied U.S. citizenship. I mean, in other words, it was funny when I announced to the world on June 3rd, 2003, I sealed the indictment of Charles Taylor. That Charles Taylor had been indicted for war crimes and crimes against humanity. Half the world was angry with me, and the other half wanted to give me the Nobel Peace Prize. So it was a very bipolar kind of event for about a year. I was either hated or loved, depending on where I was going, and I was hated in the United States. I still think there in the West Africa Bureau, there's pictures of me at the dartboard, and they still throw darts at it. Anyway, so isn't this amazing? You know, we have the bright and shining moment in the middle of that bloody 20th century, 117 million human beings dead. But in the last 10 years, we create modern international criminal law in the age of accountability, which extended all the way till around 2015, 2016, when all of the tribunals were finished with their work, except for the permanent one, which will always be around. So we see this important age of accountability. Well, this is the history very quickly, and I think it's important when you're talking to your students about this, is you have to understand this is what the courts in the modern system looks like. Of course, we have Nuremberg and the Council 10 trials, which are the trials that took place after the main event of various groups, doctors, lawyers, foreign office, what have you. Ben Ference was a part of that group. So we see the Cold War and the blank slate where nothing was done, and then all of a sudden in the 90s we see the various tribunals being created, which I've talked about, and this is the extraordinary chambers and the courts of Cambodia. One of the things that we learn in the age of accountability is, and I think it's important for you to talk to your students about this as well, is that there's no cookie-cutter approach to accountability and justice mechanisms. The international community designs these tribunals they're structured similarly, but they shape and mold it to the political demands. And so the extraordinary chambers in the courts of Cambodia, which is accounting for the killing fields in Cambodia in the 1970s, where a third of the population of Cambodia was destroyed by the junta. The world decided to step back and move this forward, and they created an internationalized domestic court. This particular court is actually in the Cambodian courts. And there are Cambodian as well as international jurists working that issue to account for the loss of over 1 million human beings. Yes, ma'am?
Is it the UN that decides whether to have the International Criminal Court?
Generally, yes. Though regional organizations can do so if they so choose, they just haven't. I've been trying to work out various methodologies by which we can account for in Syria, and using the Gulf states as a way to create a regional court. Arabs trying Arabs in violation of Arab law is a good way to do that. But the Sunni-Shia issue is so bad, they don't talk to each other, and they'll never join that. So politically, it's never going to happen. But yeah, there's a potential. So what you can do is you can have a domestic court, an internationalized domestic court, you can have a regional decision, or you can have an international decision. And these are the various decisions in the age of accountability all the way down to around 2012. All of these are now finished with their work. The Special Court for Sierra Leone was the last major tribunal, international tribunal to start, and was the first to finish. It took us 10 years, from literally stepping off an airplane with nothing to closing the doors of the court was 10 years. ICTY, ICTR, a little bit different, took them over 20 years to finish their work, but they did, so they're no longer in this. In fact, the extraordinary chambers are almost done, and this strange little administrative tribunal called the Special Tribunal for Lebanon is not really, it's just a good example of how there's an incident that takes place, and the international community designs a justice mechanism called the Special Tribunal for Lebanon for the killing of the president of Lebanon. Yes? Yes.
It seems to me like a struggle to set up each individual tribunal, because you have to obtain political support from a lot of countries to set up these tribunals. So you don't have yet, how to say, an international institution well established that can initiate and prosecute all these crimes, right?
Well, yeah. What is the struggle? I mean, none of this. I'm just showing you. I'm giving you the impression that this thing was just rolling out like it was just you're baking cookies. You just take them out of the oven, and there's the next batch going in. No, all of this is because it's all politics, and so there's a lot of political struggle in creating each and every one of these courts. From people saying not only no, but hell no, to yes, absolutely, and everything in between. And so somewhere there's a compromise, or not. Sometimes it's just because of the veto power of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, they can put a good idea to bed to include Syria. I'm the co-author of the Caesar Report, which you may have heard of, which shows direct, specific, industrialized killing on the part of Assad. I was briefing the Security Council in that famous round table, and I was showing them pictures as I'm talking, about and showing the horrific destruction of 11,000 human beings in 3 camps, or 55 camps. This is just pictures of 3, and it shows 11,000 horror stories. Some of the members of the council were actually crying. And our hope was that we were going to get a Security Council resolution to try all parties, not just Assad, but all parties, to seek accountability for these victims. Again, remember, it's foreign about the victims, these human beings who had hopes and dreams and love, and were just ruined and then killed. But China and Russia vetoed the resolution. What's that? Because Russia is backing Assad, and they weren't going to show it didn't have anything to do with it would potentially bring down Assad, who, for the first time in history, Russia has now a footprint in the Middle East, and they were not going to let that go. And then China was just voting for Russia because they didn't want to vote with the United States and France. So it's just Yeah, it's as simple as that. No, that's done forever. The International Criminal Court is out of Syria.
So, out of curiosity, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
You go ahead.
No.
Me? Go ahead.
Go
Out
ahead.
of curiosity, so if the United States, okay, if Russia, which backs Assad, I'm worried about that, would they not be implicated also in a trial like this?
It would never happen because it went to the United Nations.
But I mean, if it would pass through the United Nations, would that?
Well, I have to tell you that, in fact, I'm about to issue a white paper from the Global Accountability Initiative, which I have going, which directly shows the United States and Russia individually criminally responsible for the aiding and abetting of the crimes in Syria and in Yemen. We're providing massive amount of arms that can be directly linked. In other words, that AK-47 killed those 12 people was purchased by an agent who bought them from the United States. So I can distill a line of block. So that's aiding and abetting, classic legal theory. So they're actually, if you aid and abet, it's as if you committed the crime yourself. So again, these are real challenges. But again, that's the politics of accountability. Is that the Security Council is the operative arm of the United Nations. If they don't go along with it, it ain't going to happen. Except you can have an extraordinary creation of the General Assembly, meeting of the General Assembly. It's happened 5 times to step around the Security Council, and you're going to see more and more of that because the Security Council is deadlocked again, just like it was back in the Cold War, where it's Russia versus the United States, and Russia comes up with a good idea, the U.S. vetoes it, or France or Great Britain. If we come up with a good idea, the Russians or the Chinese will veto it. So all of a sudden, it is part of this slowdown of the age of accountability with this deadlock between the parties, just like in the Cold War. Yes, sir. And your comments and questions are great, so please raise your hand.
What constitutes an international agreement? And then I understand that you had mentioned that that could be vetoed, so I guess what would constitute an international consensus to go ahead and investigate something? And if there is member states or countries that vote against that, is there any procedure to or extenuating circumstances that would bring the issue back up again for another vote?
Well,
so I guess multiple questions.
No, but I'll answer the second question first. I just said something that there is a UN procedure that allows the General Assembly, which does not run the UN. It's just a group of nations called the General Assembly, which are all states part of the UN. They can invoke a special procedure to get around a decision by the UN Security Council. And I can tell you, we can talk more about that in a little bit. So that's that procedure. All right. Now, in order to get a resolution before the Security Council, each month the presidency of the Security Council changes. The time when I was in Syria, it was France who wanted to bring the situation in Syria to its table. So the presidency creates the agenda. And so we're working on the agenda with various countries. In other words, when we got the agenda before the Security Council related to the handover of Charles Taylor to us for a fair trial, the Danes were going to be the presidency, the Danish government was going to be the presidency in May. So we began working with the Danish government back in January about getting them to agree to place a special court for Sierra Leone on the agenda in May. If it's not on the agenda, you can't bring anything up. That's a procedural issue, but it's important, isn't it? So presidency controls the flavor of the month. All right, and if they don't agree to it, and each nation has its own reason to do certain things. The Danes had the bravery to step forward and say, we're going to put the special court for Sierra Leone and Charles Taylor on the May agenda in 2005, which resolved that Charles Taylor needed to be handed over for a fair and open trial. It didn't really happen until later, but it set the political platform by which now we can call for it. People had the political cover to say, well, all we're doing is following the UN resolution. But the operative arm is the UN Security Council, 1. 2, and they resolve to do something under a UN Security Council resolution, whatever that issue may be, restoring international peace and security, what have you. Okay? So that's how the UN becomes involved in something. That's 99% of it. Secretary General cannot do that. The General Assembly can only do that in rare circumstances. It's the UN Security Council that runs the United Nations. Secretary General is the administrative head of the United Nations and runs it on a day-to-day basis like chief operating officer. You know, it's the beans and bullets stuff, the personnel, all of that stuff. But he cannot declare, direct, or involve the United Nations unilaterally. He has to go to the Security Council, which he can do, and ask for them to consider this. And if someone doesn't want to consider it, either the presidency, and it is not put on the agenda, it doesn't happen, or if the 5 permanent members, France, China, Great Britain, United States, and Russia, don't want to do something about that, they can just throw the veto card, and it's over. So that's the real challenge of trying to seek accountability. So there's all kinds of challenges in creating a court, and I'm just kind of introducing that to you. So good question.
Thank you.
These are the challenges, I would say, that understand there are different types of law in the world. There's civil law and common law. If you're a former colony of Great Britain, which is half the world, that's common law. If you are not, it's largely civil law. All right? And that's because of French and Belgium on the other half of Germany. So it was a crazy world. In the United States, most of the world was a colony up until the turn of the 19th century. Now, accountability age of the strongman. This is amazing, and we'll stop pretty much towards the end of this. Just to show you how crazy this is. 10 years ago, we didn't have iPhones. And yet now this is fundamentally a part of our being. In fact, they're already seeing that because of the leaning to the right, I just read this while Greg was talking because I wasn't that interested in what he was doing. He said, no, I'm just kidding. I was actually reading this.
Is he still speaking?
And I was reading this at breakfast. Young people are starting to create, there's a spur, a bone spur starting on the left side of their skull because of the constant leaning towards this side, talking using the cell phone. We're actually physically changing already. Yeah, not my fault, but I'm just saying this is 10 years ago we didn't have this. When I was in Sierra Leone, we had desktops. We had no laptop. There was no such thing as a laptop. We had big, chunky, remember those? Where it was basically your desk? Yeah. And yeah, if you're in some school districts, it's probably still the same, but a lot of it, the U.S. government is that way too. But no laptops, no cell phones, clunky things, had to be wired. There was no, we weren't streaming, satellite, any of this kind of stuff. It was clunked, plugged into, and part of the telephone system. And if you're in a country that doesn't have a telephone system, it becomes problematic. We did have, the UN did have satellite dishes, very cutting edge stuff. So we had a satellite dish, we were able to draw off the UN system to have internet capability in West Africa. But how do we find out about atrocity? How do we keep atrocity focused? How do we keep people concerned? Or do we give them too much atrocity? Look at this from 1900 to 2019. How we found out about atrocity? I wonder if this works. It does. So, Heart of Darkness, novel. 10 million people dying in Congo around the world, but we find out about it through a book, Heart of Darkness, by Joseph Conrad. We had the telegraph, and during this time frame, we're seeing problems in like Armenia. We're seeing the destruction of over 1 million Armenians. Turkey, word was trickling out through the telegraph. There's some newspapers and stuff, and in fact, the British ambassador wrote to Parliament saying there are such grave crimes happening in Turkey that they're crimes against civilization. So this is the first mouthing of a word that we now call crimes against humanity. And the British Parliament resolved that Turkey should be sanctioned for this. Of course, now, in Turkey, it's a crime to even mouth the word Armenian genocide. Literally, it's a crime. You can be jailed for that. So, we move along here, and we're talking all the way down to somewhere right here is 2005. Look at this. This was pretty much, we call this a telephone. You may have heard your mom and dad talk about that. It was attached to the wall, and you had to walk to it and pick it up, and talk to it, and then put it down. Then all of a sudden, I'm in Sierra Leone, and I remember coming home, and my son has got this crazy thing in his pocket with the earphones. Now, earphones have changed too. It used to be like this. Or if you had a transistor radio, remember the one earphone you had in your old transistor radio? But he had these two things in his ear, and it was stuck in his pocket. And I go, what's that? He goes, we call these MP5s. I go, what the hell's that? And, it's the wheel, Apple and stuff, and you could put about 1,000 songs on it, and you could download them from your computer. I said, and you don't record it from, and he's like, no, we call it streaming. What? I mean, it's like I left the world, left the earth, and came back. I feel like Rick Van Winkle. It just shows you how quickly. Well, the problem is, and the challenge for us if we're doing things in places like Syria in particular, we're getting data from Syria in the amount of petabytes, which is 1,000,000 terabytes, which is 1,000,000 megabytes. So 1,000,000 times 1,000,000 times 1,000,000 is a lot of zeros. So much data that because none of it is evidence, we're having more trouble with all of now social media overwhelming us. We've got to find that one needle in this information tsunami to put into evidence. Remember, the rules of evidence don't change. I just can't take you take a picture of an atrocity taking place in Idlib in Syria, and then you download it and it goes into CNN. We can't use that CNN vignette because I've got to establish its reliability, its authenticity, and its relevance to be admitted into court. And if I don't have the guy who took the picture, who took the video, who say I took it on this phone, I was there, I can't put it into evidence. So you have this false sense that we have Assad dead to rights. That's why the Caesar report was so important, is because it was the first time we had direct, high-definition photographs and documents that directly show that he was committing crimes against humanity and war crimes. Up to that point, we had no real evidence. And that was the challenge. And so in 2016, we began to create, it was my idea because I called it the Syrian Accountability Center, and ended up being the International Independent and Impartial Mechanism for Syria. We created a UN office to take all of this stuff and turn it into evidence. And so now there are professional investigators, analysts and stuff taking all of this petabytes of stuff that we never had in West Africa just 10 years ago, and turning it into criminal information that can then be turned into evidence, which can then be turned in. So this is a curse more than it's a blessing. Yeah, the world knows more about it, but to actually prosecute, the rules don't change, and they shouldn't be, because why should I come in with a whole bunch of unreliable information, stuff that I can make up, fake? Fake news is real in the sense of the idea of fake news. I can fake everything. So that's a challenge as well. So the rules are very, very specific on how I can take you to court and prove beyond a reasonable doubt that you've committed a crime. I'm just showing you this to show you how it seems like the world is really changing in a positive way. In reality, in my business, this is a negative. This is a huge negative, because what it does is politically it gives diplomats a sense of, well, Mr. Crane, look at all this data you have on it. And I'm standing in front of the Security Council going, ladies and gentlemen, I can't prove a damn thing about Assad. I know he's done a lot of things, he's got a great historical record, and that'll always be there. But if you tell me, Crane, go to some place, build a case against Assad and his henchmen, I'm going to say, the only evidence I have right now that I could take into court as I speak is the Caesar evidence. Because I got the photographer who took the picture, I got the guy who, he had the identification number on the tortured body on the forehead, marries up with a piece of paper that the photographer signed, because he was just a forensic photographer. Every nation had, when somebody dies, they take forensic pictures. And he was just taking pictures of ruined human being. But he was, there was a paper trail. So there's reliability, there's relevance. All right, so I can bring Caesar and say, yeah, that's the picture I took, that's the identification number, and that's the piece of paper that identifies this person. And I go, Your Honor, I move Exhibit 1 into evidence. Any objection? There may or may not be objection, but it comes in because it is reliable, relevant, And so, but that's what you have to have when you prove these individuals, because these are fair and open trials. There are procedures, there's rules, there's law in this. And if you don't follow it, then it becomes a kangaroo court. So just to show you, this is not as amazing as it seems, only in the fact that it shows you how much are. And I don't have everything in there. I just ran out of space and time when I put this together.
If you don't follow it, you're going to do it.
And the crazy thing is I don't even know what half that means. So, we are in a kaleidoscopic age, an age of extremes. I'm just going to show you the slide before we have a discussion over the next 10 minutes. And that is, we're in a sea change. The world has changed fundamentally. Conflict is different. The Syrian conflict is a kaleidoscopic war. We actually are shooting in 360 degrees. We're actually providing weapon systems to Assad to fight ISIS, but yet the United States is also politically trying to overthrow Assad so that they can have a democracy. So we're literally working with the same guy we're trying to overthrow. Is your head starting to hurt? And then we have other groups that are also doing the same thing, and it turns into a kaleidoscope. And if one thing changes, everything changes. So we don't know what the end state of Syria is. Nobody can tell at any one given time. We can't plan for it. We can't project this is going to happen, so we get ready for that. There's nothing we can do other than watch it happen. So this is the kaleidoscopic age, in this age of extremes, where as we move into a more populist-oriented world, as opposed to the buying the world of Coke, the international openness of the fall of the Berlin Wall, the world now is turning internally, very much so like the 1920s and early 1930s. And so we're starting to see the rise of strongmen, individuals who are taking power, extreme power in some cases. The president of China now is president for life. Putin is, all intents and purposes, president for life. We can go right down all of the countries. And in fact, just a couple days ago, our president says, I think the American, if I get elected the second term, I'm sure the American people will demand I stay on. This is from the president of the United States. He's actually thinking this. He's mouthed these words on those Instagrams. So the point is that there are 12, 13 individuals who are now largely permanently in place, even though there's, quote, democracies. Very much like Germany. Germany was a democracy. In fact, the Holocaust was legal under German law. So the law can be a terrible swift sword, and I think that's important that you should talk to your students about too. We talk about the rule of law, but you're going to have to give some other examples as well, because again, yes, it's critical, it's important, but it's not the be-all and end-all. Right? You have to kind of give some caveats and some warnings to your students. So what it ends up doing is then, we are set up politically the same way we were in the 1930s. And I don't know where this is going. I never would have thought I would even be, just 2 years ago, I never had this slide. I never thought of it, because I thought the age of accountability was going to be the age of accountability. But what's ended up happening, because accountability is a political event, there's no interest internationally to account for atrocities. So we're seeing other ways to do it, but we're not seeing it this way. And so what ends up happening is that we have waves. The first wave was Nuremberg, the second wave was the age of accountability, and the third wave is what we're doing now. We're building mechanisms like the IIIM, the International Partial Independent Mechanism for Syria. So we're creating mechanisms. It's really, for all intents and purposes, an office of the prosecutor. But we created it in a special session of the General Assembly. This is the 5th time in history of the UN that they went around the UN and created this mechanism. We're also doing one for Myanmar, which was just approved. So we see mechanisms, we see grassroots efforts, NGOs like the Syrian Accountability Project that I founded, for example, creating and building a case just like we did against President Charles Taylor, which we are handing directly all of our evidence over to the IIIM in Geneva. So most of the credible grassroots NGO level organizations are getting all their data to the IIIM, the UN office, which is going to build that case against Assad someday. Because remember, in international crimes, there is no statute of limitations. We're still prosecuting Nazi camp guards in their 90s. We're literally wheeling them in on their beds and prosecuting them. There's no statute of limitations on this. And of course we have domestic courts. jurisdictionally, a country can prosecute somebody who harms one of their own citizens. And so we see Germany, Denmark, and Sweden and Spain prosecuting Syrians who they have in their own jurisdictions, who they find as immigrants who have caused harm to a Spanish citizen or having. So they prosecute them for the Spanish criminal law for whatever that Syrian person did. So we're actually, but it's one and twosies, but it's something. So accountability is 3 steps forward, 2 steps back. Sometimes it's 2 steps forward, 3 steps back. But we still have to, even in the age of the strong man, seek justice, remember, for that young woman, right? And so this is what you need to tell your students, is not all is lost, it's just hard. There's nothing wrong with things being hard, you still have to do this. So your students and you are the next generation from us to keep this idea of accounting for international crimes alive. Because if not, then mankind is lost. And you get that point. So with that, remember, we have to continue the fight. Now that's Charles Taylor being arraigned, the war crimes, crimes against humanity, something he thought he would never do, never be done. Now he's serving the rest of his life in a maximum security prison in England for what he has done. So he's a perfect example of someone who thought he would never get away with it, who is now serving time. Assad's the same way. The BBC asked me, he said, Mr. Crane, will Assad ever be held accountable? I said, yes, someday he will. There'll be a knock at the door, and it'll be me. So with that, if we have any time, we can ask questions or not, but it looks like Jody is coming forward to give me the book.